Okay, today's screencast is going to go over industrialization in Russia and the US, and as a subtitle, I put in there with and without socialism. Because ultimately, as we see, industrialization in Russia leads to socialism, while in the United States it doesn't. So here we go. This quote kind of sums up what we're going to go over and the different story of industrialization in Russia versus the United States. So this is from Alexis de Tocqueville. You're going to see his name thrown out a lot. He's a French philosopher, political analyst that tours America and writes about American democracy. He says the Anglo-American relies upon personal interest to accomplish his ends and gives free scope to the unguided exertions and common sense of the citizens. The Russian centers all the authority of society in a single arm. Now I'm going to stop there. You can pause it and read the rest if you like, but essentially what he's saying is that America builds its innovation, industrialization, its business on individuals, on people, people and their own efforts. While in Russia, as we'll see, all of industrialization comes from the top down. And even the communist revolution, as we'll see later in the year, is top down. It's not led by people. Okay, so big picture. We're talking about industrialization this week. We're looking at America and the Soviet Union, and what you should take from this is the process of the U.S. becoming a global power through industrialization, while Russia it starts a communist revolution, and it doesn't become sort of the industrial powerhouse as the United States. It leads to revolution and a new political system taking over. Okay, let's start in the U.S. America is primed for industrialization. It's a big country with lots of resources. There's political stability, especially after the Civil War. The war itself generated a need for raw materials and industry. The population was growing, it was big, and so that means lots of labor and a big domestic market that people in America can buy a lot of stuff from America. So after the Civil War, industrialization explodes in the U.S., and by 1914 it becomes a leading industrial power. It's known as a second wave country of industrialization. Britain and Western Europe are first to industrialize. In fact, the U.S. comes a little bit after, and it's in large part financed by loans from German and British banks, American companies borrowing from them. Now, a distinct difference in the way industrialization happens in America versus the Soviet Union is the role of government. In the U.S., the government plays a big role, helps build companies like U.S. Steel. However, their role is that the government supports the work of private business owners. People like entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie, these guys over here, Henry Ford, and Rockefeller. These guys were cultural heroes building big businesses, creating industry, creating growth in America. And the government worked with them by giving them incentives, things like tax breaks. It also provided free federal land to railroad companies so that they can build more railroads for a cheaper price. So it's not the government driving it, it's the government supporting it. America pioneered things like the assembly line. And in all of this, what's probably one of the most important things is that the U.S. creates a culture of consumption, and this ultimately will drive industry. A prime example are the Sears and Roebuck's mail order catalogs. And you guys are probably too young to remember this, but back in the day, before you bought stuff on Amazon, companies like Sears would send you these giant catalogs, and you could order everything from it. It's kind of like going to Costco, only you had to order it in the mail. And I mean, I've been in a prefabricated house that was ordered through a Sears catalog. These were popular for a while, and they're sort of like a novelty now. People still live in them. With industrialization, there were social problems, the working conditions, labor wages, things like that. But no socialism, and that's what we're going to focus on. So, why no socialism? Um, Primarily for these reasons that I'm going to go over right now. First of all, labor unions focused on skilled workers. So, unskilled workers didn't, they were marginalized, and as we'll see, they kind of were a small portion of the population. Labor unions tend to focus more on skilled workers, craftsmen, people with a specific skill. The next problem with socialism becoming a huge appeal to the masses, because remember, that's what socialism or communism seeks to do. It seeks to unite all the, proletariat, the people doing all the work. And that just wasn't going to happen in the U.S. because of divisions. There was religious divisions, Catholic and Protestant especially, racial divisions, and not just racial but ethnic divisions among Europeans as well. So you have Irish communities, Polish communities, German communities, and people not, even though they're in the same social class, even if they're all laborers, maybe unwilling to work together on things, especially when it comes to a labor movement, a social revolution. Furthermore, America's rapidly growing economy created a higher standard of living than in certainly Russia and Europe as well. And out of this emerges, the backbone of the U.S., the huge middle class that is so important to America's economy. And when you're middle class, you may not be rich, but you're certainly not poor. And you're a part of that consumer culture. You can buy luxury goods. You can participate in culture. You have better health, more access to food, healthcare, education. And the middle class is what gives sort of the lower classes hope, that I can improve my life even if I'm not rich. And, basically what it ultimately comes down to is more people are working in offices during this time. By 1910, there's more people working in offices than factories. People doing things in sales and retail, office jobs. They're not slaving away in some harsh working condition. And that's not going to create the kind of resentment and fight against the powers that be that will happen in Russia. Well, maybe not totally devoid of socialism, though. The U.S. does have, you're going to a public free school. We have today the Affordable Care Act. We have welfare programs. We have Medicaid. So it's not that socialist policy has no place in American politics, but on the whole, socialism tends to be seen as un-American. You have the Red Scare and anti-communist movements. Everyone from Senator McCarthy to J. Edgar Hoover investigating potential communist threats to America. So instead of using the term socialism, what you'll see in American politics is stuff called progressives or progressivism. And if it's un-American, progressivism has more of a place in American politics. And it starts with this guy, Teddy Roosevelt. And he and the progressives will push for specific reforms in government, so little bits and pieces of socialistic policies, but not total revolution. They're not trying to get rid of rich people and make total, financial equality. They're not trying to totally close the rich-poor gap. So Roosevelt will do things like break up companies that are too big. And later they'll push for higher wages and minimum wages and things like that, but not total revolution. Because at the end of the day, in American politics, up until now, big business dominates both parties. It takes a lot of money to get elected, and whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you have to make allies on Wall Street and big corporations. They are a pillar of our way of life. We can't, the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Bill Gates and the Walton family and the Amazons and all those huge companies play a huge role in our politics and in our way of life, our culture, and our economics. On the other hand, when we look at Russia, we see a totally different story. In Russia, Industrialization does not come from the business community. It doesn't. They don't have this entrepreneur like John D. Rockefeller building a massive industry. Instead, it comes from the monarchy, the czar. It's top down. In Russia, when they begin to industrialize in the mid to late 18th, 19th century, they don't have a parliament. They don't have representative government. There's no political parties. There's no legal labor unions to push for better wages and things like that. So that will come to haunt them later. All political power is held by one person. And harkening back to what de Tocqueville said at the beginning of this presentation, that one arm. And here's Catherine the Great, who does some industrialization policies, but it's coming from the top. Nobility holds all the social power, whereas in America, you didn't have to be royalty or nobility to be a millionaire or a big successful business owner. Serfs, even though they're freed in 1861, they don't make any progress really, and the majority of Russians by the end of their industrial period, they still live in rural villages. They don't build the same kind of city infrastructure that the U.S. does. And probably the most important thing is that transformation in Europe in Russia is always top down, and always trying to catch up to the West. It's not innovative. It's not looking forward. It's catching up. They're not pushing ahead of anyone. But industrialization does happen. Some good examples in Russia are 1861. After a humiliating loss in the Crimean War, Russians begin to feel like they're falling behind places like France and England. And so they free the serfs. It's seen as a thing of the past, and none of the Western powers have serfs or indentured servitude. They freed slaves, all that kind of stuff. It seems as something that is not, a part of the modern world. By the 1890s, they undertake a huge railroad project in the Trans-Siberian Railroad. But again, it's top down. It's put forth by the Tsar. Industrialization will lead to bad working conditions. Factory life is harsh in Russia, just like it was in Europe. But only it's probably even worse. And remember, these people who are working in the factories don't have any representation in government. No one's seeking their behalf. They don't even have legal labor unions. So if change is going to happen, they're going to have to force it to change. And that happens in 1905 when a huge portion of factory workers go on strike. And the Tsar is unhappy with this, so it's violently oppressed or suppressed by the Tsar. But the powers that be realize they have to make some changes. So they create the Duma, which is an actual nationally elected assembly to give representation. They also limit the amount of censorship, add for more freedom of the press and things like that. But with more freedom of speech and press and things like that comes more criticism of the Tsar. And this doesn't work out well for the Tsar. He doesn't like it. So in 1907, he dissolves the Duma, gets rid of the elected representatives in government, which I think he actually does twice. He does it in 1906 and then 1907 again. Eventually, the Russians will suffer kind of humiliation in World War I. They lose a ton of land in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk to Germany, and then the Versailles Treaty doesn't give them much either. So people become very upset, and in 1917, they decide to overthrow the Tsar. And the communists take over. So, in summary, industrialization plus democracy is good for business and the middle class, and it creates a global power in the U.S. However, in Russia, industrialization plus an autocratic or top-down absolute government, it leads to violent revolution and the first real communist or socialist government that we see in the world. And we'll see one later in China, but this is where it starts in Russia. And you can point a lot of it to the fact that all the transformation, all industrialization was top down. It didn't come from individuals who had incentive to improve their lives. Next week, we'll look at the decline of some other places that don't industrialize and modernize well. We'll look at the Ottoman Empire in China, and we'll compare them to Japan and Japan is a similar story to the United States, who is able to modernize, industrialize, westernize, and industrialize. All right, thanks for watching.